How are we actually able to see the sacred in our lives? Through dreams? Through madness? Through entheogens? Through visions? Or even through visionary works of art? As an artist and writer, I've pursued all these visionary paths. All of them constitute, for me, aspects of an ancient image language. It's a language that was learned in the earliest stages of our cultural history. Before Adam and Eve were banished from the garden, our eyes were open and our vision flowed with images of paradise. Before we were born, we lived in a constant dream state and experienced the first inklings of the ancient image language. Images of darkness, images of light, images of fear, wonder, desire, passion, and fertility, culminating with our painful entry into a world full of light. For years, I've been fascinated by the image of the child in my works, the child inside of us, the child we once were, the child that remains an endless source of mystery. Who was that child? I invite you to remember the first moments when that child opened his eyes to a more fantastic world, a world where art, myth, and dream interfuse. What, for example, is the earliest nightmare you can recall? I remember that as a 3-year-old child, I was awoken by a strange sound coming from the basement, the sound of water streaming in the pipes. Silently, I left my bed and stepped down the stairs. At a turning in the stairs, I saw strange creatures. They were like cybernetic skeletons streaming back and forth in the basement, and they were responsible for the strange sounds I'd heard. But the world of darkness is balanced by the world of light. I invite you now to pause and remember that moment in your lives when you first became conscious of yourself as a child newly aware of the world. I remember that once, as a child, I was sitting in the hallway of our family home. I was staring at the front door, which had 3 windows on top. My father was about to come home through that door. And at that moment, it happened. I became conscious of myself, truly self-conscious, seeing the world from my point of view. The next years of my life, as a teenager and into my 20s, were like a quest for identity. I wanted to be an artist, but how? What was the path? Like many young artists, I emulated Dali. In my early drawings, I juxtaposed oniric images and found in these juxtapositions the first traces of the image language. I also made sculptures which expressed my darker emotions. All through my teenage years, the nightmares continued. I dreamt of faceless corpses that pushed me into an open grave, or of a Venus who expressed sterility rather than fertility. I wanted to study painting, but there were no schools that taught classical techniques of painting. Instead, I spent 4 years at university studying philosophy: Plato, Nietzsche, Rousseau, Wittgenstein. But I soon felt in conflict with myself, divided and fragmented. Too much reading and reasoning pushed me towards the theater. In a play, I met a woman, a student of theater, with whom I formed a liaison for 10 years. We founded a theater troupe, made films, put on plays. I wrote, acted, and directed. After 4 years of philosophy studies, I felt like I was apprenticing myself to her emotions. But my Canadian girlfriend began to suffer terribly from mental illness, passing quickly from elation to depression. In this sculpture, I tried to capture agony and ecstasy in one expression. Unfortunately, her moodiness and madness soon overwhelmed us both. There was nothing I wanted more than to cross over the marriage threshold with her. And our failure soon brought about terrible conflicts. I began to detach myself from her and from all my friends in Toronto. An elaborate drawing called The Dance of Death displayed this dark and macabre vision of my life in Toronto coming to an end. I'd hoped to end my life there and begin a new existence in Europe as a painter. Years later, the face of my Canadian girlfriend reappeared to me as I was drawing the face of Cali, and trying to express how joy and pain, how agony and ecstasy could combine into one expression. What I didn't know at the time is that the sacred had made its appearance in my life through the eternal feminine. In the guise of this woman, I'd had my first encounter with the goddess. To study painting in earnest, I escaped to Vienna, and for 1 year I attended classes at the Akademie der Bildenden Künste. Meanwhile, I made numerous sketches at the Kunsthistorisches Museum. I studied the myths, symbols, and styles of the Greeks, Egyptians, and Aztecs. Then one day, by chance, I came across a small painting that made my heart stand still. In the works of the Viennese artist Ernst Fuchs, I found the classical techniques I sought, married with the styles and symbols of other cultures. He opened my eyes to a whole new way of seeing. From that moment onward, I started having dreams of Ernst Fuchs, a whole series of interconnected dreams where I tried to meet the man who held the secrets to the craft of painting. These dreams lasted for 10 years, until I finally met Fuchs in person. At this time, I had many fascinating dreams filled with arcane symbols, often the symbols of different cultures combined. I felt driven to paint them, to teach myself the classical techniques necessary to preserve these visions in paint. I also started wandering, backpacking, from one end of Europe to the other. I lived variously in Vienna, Munich, and the island of Malta. I kept notes of all my dreams, and my dream journals soon expanded to several volumes. I also made sketches of my dreams, and began translating the most important ones into paintings in an attempt to understand them. My painting Christ Alchemist took 10 years to complete. It was entirely destroyed once, since I was teaching myself how to paint. But as the work neared completion, I pondered its possible significance. The image had come to me in a dream. Why had I dreamt of a Christ risen from the grave and a luminous child within the alchemical chalice? Coming from the Catholic tradition, I'd always considered Christ to be a symbol of our resurrection after death. But wasn't this dream image suggesting to me that Christ was also a symbol of rebirth and of coming to birth from within? Having experienced something of a death when I'd left Toronto, and a resurrection or rebirth in Europe, this seemed entirely possible. One of the more remarkable dreams that I had while living in Vienna was a clear vision of a diptych. I dreamt I saw Christ on the left, crucified on a wheel, inscribed with the Alpha and Omega. On the right, I saw the Virgin with child, before a wheel that was breaking apart. While painting this vision, I pondered over the possible meaning of these symbols. The Alpha and Omega suggested a linear view of history, that time for Christianity had an Alpha and an Omega, a beginning and an end. And the same was true of our lives. We lived only once, from our birth to our death, and then came the afterlife of eternal heaven or hell. Meanwhile, the wheel suggested a cyclic view of history, that time, such as for the Hindus and Buddhists, was an ever-turning wheel, and so our life also cycled round. We died and were reborn repeatedly in an endless round for all eternity. Coming from the Catholic tradition, I couldn't really believe that my soul would be reincarnated for all of eternity. But I didn't believe in the eternal heaven or hell of Christianity either. Finally, I decided that all these symbols applied to this life, to this existence. Wasn't it possible that life itself consisted of a series of deaths and rebirths, and that each time we crossed an important threshold in life, like finding a vocation or getting married, we experienced a momentary death and rebirth? In this way, I was actually able to see the sacred in my life. Through dreams, I was learning that life itself is a gradual opening to the sacred, and that the image language of dreams was showing me the way. After Vienna, I lived in a small house in Malta for 2 years, in an attempt to discover my ancestral homeland. Malta is called the Island of the Goddess due to the many megalithic temples there dedicated to the goddess of fertility. While living in Malta, I came up against the marriage threshold no less than 3 times. Each of these relationships taught me new aspects of the goddess. Eventually, I made a series of 3 paintings which I called the Anima series. The first recalls a relationship I had with a Viennese girl who I met in Malta. Through her, I had the opportunity to begin a new life in Vienna, a city I knew well since I was already part of an artistic circle there. She and I both dreamt that she had become pregnant with twins, one fair like her, the other dark like me. Alas, this dream never came true. Years later, I portrayed her as Adrasteia, the goddess of necessity in the Orphic myth of creation. The bottom of the painting portrays the birth of twins, one dark, one light. Phanes, the god of light, emerges from the cosmic egg and hands his scepter to Nyx, the goddess of darkness and the night. Through my Viennese girlfriend, I felt that the goddess had tried to teach me how a higher necessity sometimes rules our lives. My next encounter with the goddess threw me over the edge of reason into madness. Our relationship was passionate, foolish, even insane. In Malta and in her homeland of Holland, we wasted no time in tearing through each other's lives, digging into our soul's darkest depths. And there, in the underworld of our psyches, we discovered childhood traumas best left forgotten. The love and pain became all too much until one day she disappeared, never to return. That event brought me as close as I ever hoped to come to madness. Alone in the house in Malta, all my childhood nightmares resurfaced. And I discovered aspects of the goddess which I never thought possible. Years later, when I tried to portray this event in my life, I realized one important truth. The child in us, though frightened and abused, remains an eternal source of light. Like a pearl, it remains pure, luminous, and untouched by all the evil that tried to consume it. If we can remember that innocent child, then the source of all evil can be defeated. My third encounter with the goddess transpired with a girl who was half English, half Maltese. I had come to Malta to rediscover my roots. Now, through her, I was being exposed to the numerous faces of the Maltese goddess. The moon, it is said, passes through 4 phases: the waxing moon, the full moon, the waning moon, and the dark moon. So it was with her. She had a different face for each phase of the moon, the last of which, the dark moon, remained hidden from both her and from me. One night, I dreamt that I discovered 4 statues which seemed to reflect 4 epochs of goddess worship in Malta. In the earliest epoch, the megalithic, she was the goddess of fertility. In the Bronze Age, the Phoenicians worshipped her as Astarte, goddess of love and pleasure. With the coming of Christianity, she appeared as the Virgin Mother. But the 4th statue in my dream was broken and fragmented. Ever and always, one aspect of the goddess remains hidden and unknown. Another night, I dreamt that she and I were to be married. We passed through a gate, and written above it were the words, "My father has the key to enter here." Then we began ascending some steps to a very strange temple. Somehow, this edifice combined both a megalithic temple and a Christian basilica. But before we could enter the sacred enclosure, the dream ended. Who was this woman? We spent years together both in Malta and in Munich, but I never really understood who she was. On the left of the painting is a book with a Gnostic text. "I am the first and the last," it says. "I am the wife and the virgin. I am the whore and the holy one. I am compassionate and I am cruel. I am foolish and I am wise." Towards the end of our relationship, I read her tarot cards. And the final card to appear was the Papist, the woman of wisdom and learning, the ancient priestess. Like an ancient priestess, she had the wisdom to end our relationship, though the sacrifice, for me, was painful to the extreme. According to an ancient myth, the goddess herself inscribed these words above the doorway to her temple: "No one has lifted my veil." By the time I had left Malta, I had experienced many faces of the goddess without ever really having comprehended her great mystery. I had approached the threshold of marriage 3 times without successfully stepping across. After my Maltese girlfriend and I separated in Munich, I found myself alone in this strange city. It was at this time, at the age of 33, that I discovered the visionary power of entheogens. One evening, under their influence, I undertook a prolonged meditation on Christ Alchemist, and the painting revealed dimensions I never thought possible. It felt as if I had entered through the image to an experience of total oneness with the divine. To remind myself of that profound experience, I painted a fragment at the bottom of the painting. Enter through the image. Years later, I wrote a book that articulated the experience. I'd experienced the world of visions through dreams and madness. Now, I had to admit to myself, entheogens had also opened the door. From then on, these sacred plants began to leave their traces in my works. I was planning on leaving Munich to begin a new life in Vienna or Paris when the goddess, I could say, made a new appearance in my life. This time, there was no conflict or uncertainty. I met a French woman, and within a year, we had moved to Paris and were married. We lived in Montmartre and the Latin Quarter before buying an apartment in the Bastille. I took it as a good omen that the rose within rose motif from Christ Alchemist appeared on the door of our building. I now had a home with my own studio. All this time I was painting, but didn't really know how to survive as an artist. My art was my passion and obsession, but I didn't know how to cross that important threshold and make it my vocation, my profession. At night, I continued to have a series of premonitory dreams concerning Ernst Fuchs. Then, in the summer of 2000, I received the invitation to work with Professor Fuchs in his Apocalypse Chapel in Klagenfurt. He took one look at Christ Alchemist and decided that I should study under him. Immediately, my wife and I moved from Paris to Monaco to work with him, she as a personal secretary and myself as a paid assistant. We lived in Monaco and later in Menton. Days were spent at the atelier in Monaco or in the large atelier of his villa near Menton. After struggling for years with painting techniques, I felt like I was finally learning the methods of the old masters in the traditional manner of direct transmission from master to apprentice. A painting, I learned, was built up in layers, according to the principles of the Misch technique. I started to lay down whites in egg tempera or calcine, then apply glazes in oil to add color and atmosphere. From then on, I approached my painting in a similar fashion, building up the work in layer after layer, using the Misch technique. But I was learning more than just technique. I was also learning how to see. Through the eyes of my master, I was learning how to see the image in 3 dimensions as I painted it, to see how colors harmonized and united in our vision. More than that, I was learning that a visionary artist, if he wishes to paint the deity of his own culture or of other cultures, must be in direct contact with the divine. Christ, or Kali, or the Buddha are not merely symbols. Their images are doorways that we can enter through to a direct experience of the sacred. Dreams, madness, entheogens, visions, and art itself. Through all of these, I was learning to actually see the sacred in my life. While working with Fuchs, I wrote the manifesto of visionary art. After returning to Paris, I published it in the first issue of my online journal, The Visionary Review. As a result, I received offers to speak about my own work and on visionary art as a whole. Once, for the Medellin conference, I had the pleasure of returning to Malta. Another time, Alex Gray and I held a dialogue on entheogens at his Chapel of Sacred Mirrors in New York. I've participated every year at Chimeria in Sedan and at the Colloque sur les hallucinations in Paris, watching these grow each year into significant cultural events. Through the publication of books and novels, my reputation as a writer is growing. But most important for me is the invitations I've received to exhibit my works in Paris and abroad. I was also blessed to discover the eco-village of Torri Superiore, just across the mountain from where I worked with Fuchs. There, each year, I have the pleasure and the duty to transmit the Mish technique to a new generation of visionary artists. With time, my passion and obsession have become my vocation and profession. The teenager who wondered how he would become an artist is beginning to find the answers. Through my art, the most important realization I've made is that life consists of a series of threshold crossings. The marriage threshold, the profession threshold, building a home, and having a child. Each time we approach one of these thresholds, the sacred appears in our lives. And so life itself is a gradual unfolding of the sacred. But life, like art, is also a work in progress. I started this painting 2 years ago as a wedding portrait, a gift to my wife and myself. While drawing, I had the fascinating idea that I would try to combine my wife's face and my own in the features of Christ in the middle. I'm looking forward to the day that I can paint this face and actually see our faces in union. Meanwhile, a new event has transpired in our lives, the birth of our son. And so it is that recently my life has accomplished what I still hope to attain in my art.